So we can start. Welcome along. As I mentioned, this particular talk is going to be a little bit more conversational, and it's with Dude here, real name Jim Dixon, but known throughout the community as Dude, and perhaps a much more foundational part of the Asterisk story than people realise. I'll let Dude tell his own story, and then we're going to turn it open for questions and answers. There's a lot more I can say, but I have a feeling that some of it will come out in the story.
Thank you. For a long time, the phone system, as everyone knew it, was brought to you by what most people generally called the phone company. It was a different phone company depending upon where you were, but no matter where you were, no matter what country you may have been from, whatever, there was something that was generally called the phone company. And it may have been run by the government, or it may have been run by the private sector, but it was monopolistic, it was proprietary, it was overpriced, and it didn't, it reflected really the good of the company, not necessarily of its customers. And for many, many years, the planet sort of had to, if they wanted to communicate, that was the option, and that was the only option they had. And the main reasons for this was because in order to provide communications in this way, it required some fairly, difficult to accomplish and some proprietary methodology and some things that, as far as they were concerned, no one else knew how to do or knew anything about, and they did their best to really try to keep it that way because they really enjoyed their monopolistic status. And as time went on, they just got, and again, it's not one particular phone company. They just all sort of developed this ability and interest in just becoming more and more and more, tyrannic. Evil, selfish, greedy, whatever you want to call it.
Up themselves?
What?
Up themselves?
Without a doubt, out for themselves. That's right. Many, many years ago, even dating back, perhaps 100 years ago, providing this service was just physically nearly impossible. There was so many different processes, physical processes that had to be done to be able to provide wiring and equipment and just the basic facilities for these communications to occur. And as a result, the world and the governmental bodies and things that were dealing with this sort of got used to the concept that these were difficult things to do, they were expensive to accomplish, and therefore the cost of them was going to be expensive. Over a course of time, the various companies devised ways to make their profit margins higher while still charging the same prices. Some amount of that I can understand, but these companies just kept getting more and more and more that way. There were some major advances in various technologies, particularly switching technologies, that towards the end of that era gave the various phone companies the ability to really, really, really gouge their customers, providing services that cost them very, very little to do and charging ridiculous amounts for them. And, it got to the point where it just became ridiculous and these things just had to change. For a while there, it was very clear to me that the way to solve this problem was to provide the same functionality, this telephone network, to provide the same functionality that they do with their proprietary means in a way that is, available and have the knowledge available also for the public, for anybody in the public, any business, any person, whatever, to be able to have part, whatever part of the telephone network that they want in their own hands, rather than in the hands of just these monopolies. And the way to do it was for computing, for regular computers, just a regular, like a personal computer, to be able to have the power to be able to provide the same functionality that these proprietary devices previously had, except just in a regular computer like everybody has, which became fairly inexpensive and fairly easy to do. And my personal experience with telephone switching and telephone systems, and knowing how they work, and what they are and what the pieces are, and how they interact and communicate, etc. And my ability to being pretty good at systems design, and understanding, given a processing system, and given something that it needs to do, to be able to really assess how much processing you really need to do given a particular processing technology to be able to accomplish it. So I was seeing, in the 90s, I was seeing, as things were progressing in computers, that the time was coming soon. I knew that soon that a standard PC, like anybody would have on their desk at their office or their home, should, with very minimal external hardware, be able to accomplish the task of being a real telephone switch, just like whatever the phone company in your area has in their office.
Can I jump in for a minute and
Sure.
just ask a quick question? So how many people are old enough to remember people like Dialogic and Natural Microsystems and Brook Trout? And I worked for a company called Aculab. So back in the day, these guys were charging tens of thousands of dollars for their products, right? And so this is the era in which Dude is having these visionary thoughts. Sorry, I just wanted to...
Oh, thank you. And it's not just that. It's the, basically big iron switches that were actually in, telephone company central offices, like here in North America. We had Western Electric hardware, we had Northern Telecom hardware. A lot of these switches would cost phone companies multi-millions of dollars, and oftentimes take up a good part of, or an entire part of a good size data center. And all of these things, I could clearly see were going to become unnecessary and outdated sometime soon. And I had a very, very good idea of what it would take for a computer to do this, and I was sort of monitoring the progress of how computer systems were becoming faster and more capable, etc. And towards the very end of the 90s, when the Pentium 3 came out, I pretty much had a very good idea. In fact, it turned out to be an absolutely accurate idea that the time was then. And so right around the end of the 90s, I started looking and seeing, because I figured, okay, obviously this is the thing that needs to happen, and obviously somebody's going to do it, and at least from what I could tell, we were there as far as having the computing power available. So I was figuring, okay, there must be a bunch of people doing this, or at least thinking of doing it. So I waited a few months, I looked around, I was just, like I said, expecting that I would see this be happening. And it wasn't even on anybody's radar. No one was thinking about it. No one even had this concept. So I finally realized that, gee, maybe it's me that's supposed to do this. So that's what I did. Basically, knowing all of the things that a phone switch was, knowing what all of the phone switch needed to be, being a good system designer, etc., I basically said, okay, well, it's time for a revolution. This stuff needs to change. So I designed a couple at the beginning, a couple of different cards to go on a standard x86 type PC. The first one was an ISA card on the old ISA bus, and then after that was successful, then we did a PCI design. But the idea is that if I can demonstrate that this technology is viable and that you can actually process phone calls and switch phone calls, using these designs, that, some people would come along and say, okay, clearly that's the case. Let's, build an entire switch out of this and let's change the world. So it's basically what I did. I designed all of the hardware and system stuff. I implemented it. I had basically the hardware, the kernel drivers for, in this case it started out for FreeBSD. It then shortly changed to Linux after that, when I discovered that the interest was in Linux, not in FreeBSD. A user-side library and a few user-side applications that did things like conferencing and voicemail and, simple call switching, just things to demonstrate that, it worked. And I released it all completely and totally free, completely and totally open. It wasn't even open source, it was public domain. It was, completely unlimited for anybody to do anything with.
Can I jump in again for a
Sure.
minute? And that means that the circuit diagrams, the Gerber files, everything was out there,
everything, I provided on the web. I provided everything that was necessary. If you wanted to make your own boards, all you had to do is download my files, take it to a PC board house, and you had boards.
And it can still be seen to this very day.
Oh, yeah,
can't it?
yeah, absolutely. All the information's still there. So
just before you get on to the next part of the
Oh,
story,
sure.
what was it that made you want to do that rather than running away with the visionary idea yourself and creating a commercial product?
Well, it was a lot to me. It was a lot more important for the world to have this ability in their hands than for me to have a few dollars. I mean, you could have handed me $1 billion right then, and still, compared to the value that it gave the world, that would just be, a pebble of sand in a big beach somewhere. I mean, there's no amount of money that could have equated that. So I just said, well, this is silly. Obviously, this is what I need to do. That was just me. I mean, maybe there's something wrong with me or something, but I'm not greedy.
Okay, so please continue with the story.
Okay. So anyway, so I released the stuff to the public. I said, like I said before, it was originally done under FreeBSD, and I kept getting emails back saying, when is this going to be available for Linux? When is this going to be available for Linux? So after about 4 days of that, I sort of realized that the handwriting was on the wall, as they say. And personally, I had never run Linux before. I really didn't know a whole lot about it. In the years before that, I'd seen people in data centers, lamenting over trying to get their servers not to crash under load, under Linux, etc. And it just hadn't been mature or stable enough at that point, and that was my entire exposure to it. And I just figured, that just didn't seem terribly interesting or appropriate for what I was trying to do, and that's really all I ever knew about it. But when the people were interested in it, and people were exclusively interested in it, I said, okay, well, I guess I need to find out. So this was back in the good old days, or at least in the old days, however you want to look at it, when you could still go to a computer store and buy software in a box off the shelf. So I went to the local computer store and I bought a copy of Red Hat. I think it was 5.0 at the time. Boy, that was a long time ago, off the shelf. And I took it home and I loaded it on a PC. And the very, very first thing I did was I loaded the disk that had the kernel sources, particularly the sources for various ISA drivers. And I looked at the source for a very, very simple ISA driver, and it was extraordinarily similar to the structure and the functionality of a driver in FreeBSD or in standard Unix. I mean, I'd been writing standard Unix drivers and some in FreeBSD for quite a while, so I was certainly familiar with the process. So that night, the very, very first thing I did in Linux was I ported the driver to Linux. And I don't know, it's kind of a strange thing to do as the first thing in your operating system. It's kind of like, jumping in face first, but that's what I did. So I got the thing working that night, and I compiled the user library and user code, and I was very impressed with the compatibility between BSD and Linux. The user side stuff, I had to change one line of source code, and it compiled, and it worked, and it did very well. So I released that at that time, and I figured that, at some point somebody would come along and say, "Gee, that's really cool. Let's get together and let's do some stuff with this, et cetera, et cetera." So the next morning I woke up and I had this email from this guy that basically said, "Gee, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I'm glad you did this, and I have something I think that would go along very well with this. I'd like to talk to you about it." And that was Mark Spencer. That's how I met Mark. And yes, he definitely did have something very, very interesting, the concept of Asterisk. And so Mark and I got together and created the Asterisk that everybody knows now. And we literally changed the world. That's what we did.
And just before you go on, or before we open it up for questions, could you relate that little story that involves Linus Torvalds as well for the folk?
Well, I've never really had any direct contact with Linus other than the fact that, this was actually secondhand, but there was some question about something we were doing that Mark emailed to the LKLM, the Linux kernel mailing list, and Linus responded in some sort of a rather, overbearing and pompous sort of negative way. Boy, that's a shock. And I have that quoted on the Zapata telephony site. That's the only thing he's ever said about this stuff.
Yeah, and by the way, if you want to see all this, it's zapatatelephony.org, right?
Yes, that's
so
correct.
It's still available out there. And not only can you go to the site, but there's even an archive on that site of the previous stuff.
Yeah. The original site. There's a link at the top that has a pointer to the original site that has, again, like David said, all of the information about the original cards and the project status and the design philosophy and we don't need no stinking DSP, things like that.
So just before we go for questions or let Dude carry on, so I was asking you about Dialogic and natural microsystems and stuff like that. Well, I used to work for a company called Aculab in the UK, and we were like a UK version of Dialogic. We were making money by selling people DSP cards and line cards to connect up to E1. So before we ever heard of Asterisk, one day somebody discovered zapatatelephony.org, and it kind of went around the company like wildfire. Some dude somewhere has put this stuff out so that people can make cards for like sub $1,000 that we're charging people a very large amount of money for. So we were quite shocked about that.
Well, yeah, actually, the Tormenta, the original Tormenta ISA card, I was selling for $275. Their company was selling the equivalent functionality for about 10 grand. There were some other companies that were doing it for about 13. So, I figure that $275 is probably a lot, and open, and available so that if there's something wrong, you can fix it. That was another big problem with computer telephony at the time. Was a lot of the companies were offering just unfixable brokenware, and this solved that problem too.
And lots of very proprietary APIs out there.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah,
very
everything was just really proprietary.
So I noticed we got a question from Michael. Before we get to it, we will get to it, Michael. Before we get to that question, can you talk a little bit, Dude, about the early days of Digium when the cards started selling, when you were working with Mark?
Yeah, basically, this was a very radical concept. The idea that, you could actually just make money selling just hardware. It doesn't have anything proprietary about it. It doesn't have anything special about it. There's nothing secret or unique or anything else. Basically, you're just selling a piece of hardware that somebody could make themselves, but it's a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot better for them to buy it from you than going through all the trouble of making it yourself. I don't know if any of you have experience in this, but any time that you make some sort of an electronic circuit on a PC board, there's a rather steep cost especially with doing initial prototyping. And one a more modern case of the same business model, like say the Raspberry Pi, for example, is another very good example. You've got a company or two that's selling this completely and totally open source design, and for $35 you can buy a computer, or you can download all the files and take it to a house, and et cetera, et cetera. And by the time you're done, you probably spent $5,000. So much better value, and it's much easier to have somebody just make it for you and send it to you than having to deal with all of that stuff yourself. So it's the same sort of business model where, yes, people can certainly make good money doing exactly that. What you're selling doesn't have to have some sort of proprietary intellectual property. You don't have to be monopolistic. You don't have to be selfish. Business can exist where everybody wins, and that's something that I very strongly believe in.
That's a great ethos, and of course that selling of the cards was very instrumental in Digium's early growth, wasn't it?
Yes, in fact, when the whole thing first started, Digium per se didn't even exist. It was Linux support services. Mark was running a company that its primary goal was to provide commercial support for people that wanted it for Linux systems. I mean, I think that was a very good idea in itself, because Linux and other obviously open source operating systems are a great thing to have, but if you're a commercial company, you need to either have someone on hand or have someone available that can support the thing, open source or not. And that's one of the things that their company was providing, was commercial support for these non-commercial operating systems, and it was a great idea. And that's what their company primarily did. But Mark had this interest in Asterisk and in providing telephony hardware, et cetera. And I convinced him that this business model would work. And it took the confidence wasn't 100% there for the first while, but they believed in me, they believed in the concept, and after a couple of months, they definitely had their proof. There was no question.
Great. Okay, so I see there are a few questions out there. Let's go to Mike first. And Mike, can I hand you the mic, Mike, so you can ask your question?
Well, actually, it was just a comment because, and you kind of covered it. I was just looking at the old website, and it's pretty cool because it talks about the cards available from Linux support services in Alabama. And it says, for information on pricing and availability, please contact Mark Spencer, markster@linuxsupport.net. So, I mean, that was where it was. Send him an email. Tell me about your cards.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's old school there. And actually, dude, what we didn't mention was why you called the project Zapata telephony and why you called the card the Tormentor. Oh,
the reason that I called... obviously, I mean, I knew I was starting a revolution. That was my entire intent from the very beginning. I mean, a revolution is exactly what needed to happen, The phone company, regardless of, we had ours here, everybody had theirs there, but nonetheless, they were a tyrant. And it was, in all definition, a revolution. And that's the motif I wanted to go with. And, being born and raised in San Diego, right out next to the border of Mexico, it was just natural to me to go with the motif from that country, and I had two choices: was either Francisco Pancho Villa or Emiliano Zapata, and I just picked the Zapata, and that's what I went with. And since we were doing the Mexico thing, I just was trying to come up with a decent name for the card, and I used Tormenta because. It basically means a storm, kind of like a really serious storm. And that's what I was trying to brew.
And brew it, you did.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, any other questions for Dude there? Yes, sir.
So the original Tormenta was basically just a T1 interface back into the...
Yeah, it was a two T1 interface on the ISOBUS, yes.
So why'd you choose...
Or E1.
To go T1 rather than FXO or something like that on your card? I mean, what was the driver for the T1?
Well, the idea there is that if you wanted to actually interface directly with the T1 from another switch, you had it. And if you wanted to have analog fan out, that's what channel banks are for.
And of course, Adtran play a little bit of a part in the story, don't they? Who have channel banks?
Well, there's a lot of company made channel banks, but yeah, Adtran was certainly one of them.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that, John. Any other questions? It's seeming like there's no further questions. So in that case, if you want to come and talk to Dude privately, you can have your own audience with Dude. And I believe that photo opportunities are also available. But with that, let's say a very, very big thank you to somebody that truly did help change the telecommunications world, Jim Dude Dixon.